Queen Njinga was an Kimbundu ruler of several West Central African kingdoms between 1624 and her death in 1663. She is best known for her defiant, decades-long struggle against Portuguese colonization in her homeland of Ndongo. Though they didn't take her seriously at first, she would earn herself a reputation as the most powerful adversary the Portuguese ever faced in Africa, clawing herself back from the jaws of defeat to regain her power and fight the invaders to a standstill. And when she was too tired to continue fighting, she secured a peace on her own terms to live out her final days ruling as an independent queen. This video is part of Untold Black History II, a collaboration aimed at discussing uplifting Black history from around the world. The full playlist is in the description down below, and in the pinned comment. Born into the royal family of the Kingdom of Ndongo around 1582, Njinga was marked as special from the day of her birth. She was born in breech position with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, and according to Kimbundu beliefs, this unusual birth foretold that she would live an unusual life. Njinga showed remarkable intelligence and physical skill from an early age, and her talents caught the attention of her father, who allowed Njinga to learn about the political, military, and ritual activities usually reserved for boys in Ndongo. After he inherited the title of Ngola from Njinga's grandfather in 1592, Njinga's father allowed her to sit in on the many councils over which he presided, and to practice the use of weapons like the battle axe, with which she showed exceptional skill. As early as 1602 to 1603, she appears to have started putting her military training into practice, commanding troops on the battlefield and even fighting alongside them. Her early education in politics, warfare, and rituals would prepare Njinga for the tasks she would experience later in life, while her military experience would further win her popular support. After their father died in 1617 without designating an heir, Njinga's brother, Ngola Mbande, took the throne. In order to secure his own power, Mbande quickly eliminated potential rivals to the throne, which included having Njinga's young son killed, and she and her sisters sterilized so that they couldn't give birth to any more sons. Although Njinga would continue to work with her brother, she never forgot this betrayal, and in its aftermath she began forging her own independent base of supporters in the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, further inland from Ndongo. Since 1575, Ndongo had faced regular conflicts with the expanding Portuguese colony of Angola. The Portuguese had come to West Central Africa primarily in search of slaves to ship westward to their colony in Brazil, and to sell to the Spanish-American colonies. Although their forces were small in number and generally outmatched against local soldiers with better experience of the terrain, they were able to ally with some of Ndongo's sobas, local rulers who served a similar role to feudal lords in Europe, as well as at times bringing in allied forces from the Kingdom of Congo. In the 17th century, the Portuguese also found another source of local allies in the form of the Imbangala, an array of mercenary bands united by a common warrior ethos. The Imbangala were widely feared in West Central Africa for their brutality, and especially for their practice of eating the flesh of defeated enemies, which appealed to the Portuguese. Not the cannibalism itself, that freaked out the Portuguese too, but the intimidation factor of their local reputation. Although successfully pushing back Portuguese advances at times, Ngola Mbande found himself fighting a losing war, and chose to pursue a diplomatic solution. To this end, in 1621 he appointed Njinga to lead a delegation to meet with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, in Luanda. Upon arriving to meet with the governor, Njinga found herself presented with no seat, instead being expected to sit on a rug on the floor before the governor, positioning herself as a subordinate. Rather than accept this position, Njinga reportedly wordlessly signaled to one of her servant women, who dutifully took a position atop the rug on her hands and knees, allowing Njinga to sit on her back at eye level with Jesusa. Njinga proved herself a shrewd negotiator, but her brother's sincerity was still questioned. To prove Ndongo's commitment to peace with the Portuguese, Njinga agreed to convert to Christianity, and was baptized in Luanda shortly afterwards, taking the name Ana Jesusa, after the governor. Njinga's diplomatic successes only grew her popularity among the Kimbundu, and upon her return to Ndongo, Mbande increasingly began to rely on her for advice, to the point where she became the de facto ruler of the kingdom herself. Despite Njinga's negotiations with the Portuguese at first seeming fruitful, relations soon broke down as the Portuguese failed to honor their side of the arrangement and continued to expand their holdings in West Central Africa, even sacking Ndongo's capital. Seeing how the Portuguese continued to exploit, betray, and in some cases even enslave sobas who had submitted to their rule, Mbande became increasingly pessimistic about the chances of true peace with them, and reportedly committed suicide by poison in 1624. Njinga was made the regent to Mbande's young son. Just as her brother had consolidated his power by killing potential rivals, including Njinga's infant son, Njinga showed similar ruthlessness in securing her own power, executing a number of family members and allegedly killing her nephew personally. By 1625, Njinga had been recognized as the new Ngola of Ndongo, becoming the first woman to hold this position. With her great popularity, many Mbundu people rallied around her, and many commoners and enslaved people in Portuguese Angola fled to Ndongo to seek refuge. Njinga at first tried to re-establish peace with the Portuguese and regain the lands they'd taken, including Ndongo's traditional capital at Kabasa, but they proved unwilling to help the ambitious queen improve her own position. Instead, they demanded that she make heavy concessions herself first, including becoming a vassal of the Portuguese king and returning enslaved people and soldiers who had fled from Portuguese Angola into her lands. Njinga refused to submit to these demands, and the Portuguese continued to fight against her. They handpicked their own candidate for the throne of Ndongo in the hopes of replacing Njinga with a puppet. They chose a descendant of an earlier king who had been overthrown by Njinga's grandfather, allowing them to paint Njinga as a usurper, though this argument seems to have held little sway with the Mbundu. In letters to the Portuguese king, the Portuguese governor further presented Njinga as an illegitimate ruler due to her gender, pointing out that no woman had ruled before her. Among the Mbundu, meanwhile, the competence she showed outweighed gender biases in gaining her support. Although Njinga made significant gains against the Portuguese between 1625 and 1626, the tide turned again afterwards, as the Portuguese brought in reinforcements and managed to sway more Sobas from Njinga's side to their own. Ultimately, she was pushed to the Kwanza River's Kindonga Islands and surrounded by the forces of Portugal and their local allies. Under cover of darkness, Njinga fled east with many of her followers. Between 1626 and 1629, she waged a guerrilla campaign against the Portuguese and their local allies, while cutting off Portuguese access to the slave trading routes from the interior that funded their colonial activities in Angola. Although the Portuguese demanded that they turn over Njinga if she entered their lands, local Sobas continued to support her, even refusing to divulge any information of her whereabouts in the face of attacks on their lands and torture. However, in May of 1629, the Portuguese finally caught up to Njinga, capturing her two sisters and forcing her into a continuous retreat. In a desperate situation, Njinga sought a new tact. She joined the Imbangala leader Kasanje, and after spending some time studying Imbangala customs and being initiated as an Imbangala warrior herself, formed her own Imbangala band. In 1631, a Jesuit missionary in Congo disdainfully compared her lifestyle to that of the Queen of the Amazons, and recorded that she was going before her own people, increasing the spirits of all, and that she offered asylum to their slaves fleeing to her with a great financial loss to the Portuguese who had deprived her of her kingdom. Between 1631 and 1635, Njinga marched into the kingdom of Matamba, where she had a strong support base, and seized the throne from the local queen. In the process, she became the first Imbangala leader to maintain Imbangala practices while also ruling over a state. At the same time, she reinforced her claims to power among the Mbundu by combining Mbundu traditions with her Imbangala practices, such as by recreating the court of her childhood in Matamba. From her new seat of power, Njinga launched repeated incursions into Portuguese Angola, trying to recapture her old lands and pressure the Portuguese to release her sisters. For decades, Njinga waged continual wars against the Portuguese. In the 1640s, she formed an anti-Portuguese alliance with the Dutch and the Kingdom of Congo, whose own relationship with Portugal had long since soured. These efforts saw marked success against the Portuguese. Njinga and her allies whittled down the Portuguese area of control, with Njinga pushing westward and the Dutch managing to capture much of the coast, including the capital of Luanda. However, before the Portuguese could be defeated once and for all, several things went wrong for Njinga. First, the Portuguese uncovered letters proving that her sister Fungi had been acting as a spy from captivity and executed her by drowning. Then, in 1648, a Portuguese armada arrived off the coast and bombarded Luanda. The Dutch forces folded and agreed to leave Angola, abandoning Njinga to the Portuguese. At this point, Njinga was in her 70s and had spent decades resisting the Portuguese. Most people in her situation would probably cut their losses and give up, but Njinga was not most people. Instead, she simply decided to change tact once again. In one of her last major battles, Njinga captured a number of Spanish Capuchin missionaries, and through them saw a new way to pressure the Portuguese. See, the strongly religious society of Portugal meant that the Catholic Church had significant sway over their actions, and thus, making direct connections to the Church in Rome could give Njinga the means to influence Portugal. However, the majority of missionaries in West Central Africa were Jesuits, who officially acted as the missionary wing of Portuguese colonialism. By contrast, the Capuchins were mostly Spanish, and were viewed with suspicion by the Portuguese authorities. This made them uniquely sympathetic to Njinga and Ndongo, giving her an opportunity to make inroads with the Catholic Church by working with them. In 1651, the head of the Capuchins in Luanda received a letter from Njinga indicating that she wished for him to baptize her people. Although her reputation as someone who'd abandoned Christianity to become an Imbangala made the Capuchins cautious, she ultimately won them over with arguments that she'd been forced to leave the church by Portuguese aggression, and soon she had a voice in the Vatican. The Capuchins expressed that Portugal had taken Njinga's lands by force, and by 1652 they were advocating for missionaries sent to the region to be taught Kimbundu instead of Kikongo, to direct their efforts toward ndongo-matamba over Congo. During the same period, Njinga pursued political diplomacy with the Portuguese, hoping to secure the release of her sister Kambu, who now went by her Christian name of Barbara. The political climate in Luanda was shifting in her favor. The new governor was a nephew of Jesusa, the governor who had been Njinga's godfather, and she made sure that her envoy told him about this and that she still had the family name. She asked him to free Barbara and asked how many slaves to send as ransom, as she was old and wanted a blood relative by her side in her final years. The governor said that he could not give her an answer without consulting his council, but assured her that as his uncle had been her godfather, he would do everything in his power to free Barbara. Father Cortona, a Capuchin missionary who had been elected as the prefect to form a station in Matamba, became another voice Njinga used to advocate for Barbara's release. When he alerted her of his plans to travel to Matamba, Njinga responded in no uncertain terms that he would not be allowed to enter unless Barbara were by his side. With this, Njinga created a strong pressure for the Capuchins to aid her in her political goals, so that she would allow them to fulfill their own goals of spreading Christianity. All the while, Njinga continued wars, demonstrating her strength and convincing the Portuguese not to fight against her, and maintained an effective blockade of the slave trading routes from the interior to Angola, depriving the Portuguese of their main economic activity in West Central Africa. In the closing days of September 1656, Njinga and her counselors engaged in a series of negotiations with Portuguese representatives. She objected firmly to provisions of the proposed treaty specifying that she would pay an annual tribute to the Portuguese, calling the Portuguese presumptuous for including such a provision. Njinga explained, "In regards to the paying of tribute that you claim from me, there is no reason to do so, because having been born to rule my kingdom, I should not obey or recognize another sovereign, and to go from absolute lady to become a servant and slave would be a great embarrassment. If the Portuguese want a gift from me every year, I would give it to them voluntarily, as long as they equally give me one, so that we both would deal with each other courteously." Njinga was successful, with the final version of the treaty making no mention of tribute. In exchange for access to Matamba's markets and promises of military aid from Njinga, the Portuguese agreed to set the Lucala River as the boundary between Njinga's ndongo-matamba and Portuguese Angola, to send people to repopulate lands they'd laid to waste, and to free Njinga's sister. Accompanied by Portuguese escorts and a Capuchin priest, Barbara arrived in Njinga's capital on October 12th, and the sisters had a tearful reunion. Njinga never let her guard down from the Portuguese, and continued to maintain strong connections with the Capuchins, and through them to Rome, even exchanging some letters with the Pope. She spent the rest of her life cultivating a strong Christian kingdom of ndongo-matamba, and died peacefully around the age of 80 in 1663, passing her crown onto her sister, Barbara. Njinga lived a remarkable life. Ever adaptable, she applied diplomatic, military, economic, and religious pressure alike to resist Portuguese encroachment, and at different times turned to Umbundu, Imbangala, and Christian traditions to secure her position. While the Portuguese's puppet emperor and vassal Sobas saw themselves continuously exploited and trampled on, Njinga's decades of resistance ultimately paid off, allowing her to rule on her own terms until the end of her days. Long after her death, she remained an icon of resistance against imperialism among her people and their descendants, from West Central Africa to Brazil. Today, she remains a national icon in Angola, and a symbol of African independence. This video has really only scratched the surface of Njinga's story. That said, my research notes aren't going anywhere, so if you'd like to learn more about this fascinating history, please let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, everybody. And after you've liked, subscribed, and done all the other YouTube stuff on this video, remember to check out the rest of the Untold Black History II playlist, linked in the description down below. I've been Soma, and I'll see you next time.